we might next week we'll do the transition from Shmuel to Melachim. But I think the biggest topic I want to discuss in Sefer Melachim and Sefer Shmuel is the famous topic why David can't build the Beit HaMikdash, but behind that is why David can build the Beit HaMikdash. And I want to dedicate today's shir to understand why David doesn't come out so great in Sefer Shmuel, but in Jewish history, in our tefillot, he becomes like a star. So the David of Tehillim, the David of Divrei Yamim is very different than the David of Sefer Shmuel. I'll try to give the reason for it. I was alluding to it. And I want to use some of the stories in Sefer Shmuel to understand what makes David special. Okay, so let's share the screen. And here we are, and our source sheet. Here we are. Okay. So the goal of our series, again, is to understand the purpose of each book. I'm suggesting that Shmuel was composed to explain to the people that despite all the questions about the Davidic dynasty, God indeed chose him, and we have to counter the rumors that might appear David not being good, but he really was okay. And when he did do something wrong, like the story of David and Bathsheba, that he did tshuva and God accepted his tshuva. Now, again, in our book, a later Navi is quoting selectively from the works of 3 prophets, and I can take each section by itself and try to understand why that section was written, and then later ask the question why our prophet is putting all those different specific sections together. So last week we talked about, in Shmuel Aleph, we talked about establishing that Shmuel is a shofet, and it was accepted by everybody, the first 7 chapters. Then that God indeed wants a king, even though you might think it's a bad idea. That was 8 to 10. And then the kingdom of Shaul, and explaining how great he was, but why he lost the kingdom from the beginning, pretty much. And then 15 and 16 is sin with Amalek and God taking the kingdom away from him, and setting the stage for David's rise to power. That was the first share. Second share we did Megillat God, from chapter 17 in Shmuel Aleph till chapter 4 in Shmuel Bet, and basically how the hand of God, we talked about the hand of God, G-O-D, through the prophecies of God, G-A-D. That was our title last week. And we try to show how little by little David is always saved by God, and Shaul is always fumbling, thanks to God. And first Shaul tries to get rid of David. First, to explain why Shaul hates David, why he thinks he's a threat to his kingdom, and threat to the Jewish people, how Shaul tries to get rid of him without telling anybody, then just sharing his cabinet, and then telling the whole country he's public enemy number 1, which ultimately leads to the lack of his support and David's rise to power and the fall of the house of Shaul. So today, we're going to talk about the unit of Natan. There are 2 units of Natan, chapters 5 through 8, which are very positive about David, and 9 to 20, which are very negative about David, which is primarily the sin of David's sin with Bathsheba and his punishment. If I look at that unit of chapters 9 through 20, chapter 9 will be the background of what happened with Mephibosheth in the first place, and the war against Ammon, how it started. And that chapters 9 and 10 will be the background that leads to David's sin with Bathsheba. And then we have David's sin with Bathsheba, then followed by all of his punishments. In the Mashal, he says the guy should pay 4 times over, and David loses 4 children. Which are the 4 children? That's a big machloket, but definitely David's punished for that sin. He takes responsibility, but he's also punished. And what the book is doing, I could take all these events, I can give a natural reason for all these terrible events in David's life. I can give a very natural political reason for Avshalom's revolt, because Yoav is power hungry and he doesn't like David's choice of Shlomo. I can give really good political reasons. I can give good political reasons why David sends Avshalom away, why Amnon slept with Tamar, and why Avshalom goes and kills Amnon. All the stories that are disastrous in David's life, I could give standalone reasons for why they happened. What the book is doing, by making them one unit, it's saying these were the punishment, this was David's punishment for his sin with Bathsheba. And we'll talk about, if we have time later, the connection between them. If we have time, we'll talk about the final prakim, which we attribute to God, and we'll explain why they belong to God, and what they're doing at the end of the book, even though they happened earlier. I want to focus first and foremost on chapters 5 through 8, where it begins with Malchut David building up Yerushalayim, capturing Yerushalayim, moving his capital there, bringing the Aron to Yerushalayim. We talked about that last week briefly. Wanting to build a house for God in Yerushalayim. Then David's wars, where he funds the temple. And then I'm going to begin today's shir where we left off. The end of this unit, why it's a unit, and why the end of the unit is so important. The last time, chapter 8. So I'm going to stop my share here, open up a Tanakh, and share. That's not what I want to share. I want to share, not that. Here we go. Post attendees. We want to open up a Tanakh, and not that one. We want this one. Okay. We want to open up Sefer Shmuel Bet. And let's take a look one parak at a time. Shmuel Bet Parak Hey. Okay. Point number 1 in Parak Hey. My claim was, where are we? Look at the Parshiot. I wanted to attribute the first 3 psukim to the last unit, because this is the end of the unit of God. When all the Shvatim come to David in Hebron and said, all along we wanted you to become king, you're the one who brought us to war, etc. That's closing up the story that began with David and Goliath, where he was the Motzi Mevi and he became Shaul's big general, and everyone was, sang about him more than Shaul. And then we also mentioned, you're the one who God said was going to become the king over Israel. That was Shmuel's prophecy beforehand. And all the elders of Israel come to Hebron and to make a brit with the king in Hebron, in front of God. And that concludes the unit that began with David and Goliath and David being hated by Shaul, being public enemy number 1. It ends with, thanks to God's intervention, David becomes king, Shaul and all his household dies, and everyone is united in David's kingdom. And David doesn't come into power by force, but rather by public acceptance. And therefore, he's always reluctant to take power by force. He lets God handle the events. And he only becomes king when the whole nation accepts him as king. He doesn't want to force his kingdom. He wants people to want him to become king. Then we have the classic unit that all the units begin with. Ben Shoshim Shana David Mocho. All the units in Sefer Melachim begin that way. And he was king for 36 years in Hebron, or 7 years in Hebron, and 33 in Yerushalayim. And the first thing he does, he captures David. He moves his capital there. And then he brings, he gets funding and makes a business deal with Zor, with Lebanon, to bring wood to Pharaoh's building projects. And this was key, Pasuk Yud Bet. Vayeda David kechinu Hashem lemelech Yisrael. David is always checking his pulse. Is God with him or not? So David knows that the fact that all the elders came and accepted him, and the fact that he has positive relationships with Lebanon, and they're providing him with lumber, and he's able to build a house, able to at least his own palace at this stage, that he sees God was behind this. Again, David, as opposed to Shaul, attributes everything to God, not to himself. And David knows that God really has him ready and prepared and wants him to become king over Israel. And it's thanks to God that his kingdom is shining now, all for the sake of his people. It's one of the key points about David. David relates his entire success to God. Remember, L'chashem Agdullah, as we say every day in by Varech David. And that's very different to Shaul, who recognizes God, but it's his kavod, his glory is at the center. We'll see that in the story in a minute with Michal. Then we have David's wives in Hebron, etc. And then the plishtim here that David became king, and that what? Remember, he was used to be friendly with the plishtim. Now he's on the other team, and now he's in Yerushalayim. Can anyone explain me why they attack at Emek Rephaim? Why Dafka Emek Rephaim? Why the plishtim coming to Emek Rephaim? If you know your geography of Israel, any Israelis who might know. So you know there's restaurants in Emek Rephaim, don't you?
No.
You never heard of Emek Rephaim? And now they're redoing the whole street. But way back, Emek Rephaim is a big street. Now, what's famous about, at the end of Emek Rephaim, what landmark is there? And the Rehov Emek Rephaim ends by
With which direction?
the northern part, the northern end.
The old city.
Right before the old city. It stops before the old city. Emek Rephaim is the old Tachana, is the old train station. Now,
then there's a tremendous cliff.
Yeah, when the Turks built the train station.
Cliff.
Yeah, when the Turks built the train station, the train ended in Emek Rephaim, at the end of Emek Rephaim, at the top of at the end of the valley, at a hill before you go down the hill to the old city.
The Sultan, Brechat Sultan.
Before Brechat Sultan. Why? Because there's a valley, Derech Hebron. If if you know the street, Derech Hebron, which goes from basically from Beit Lechem past King David Hotel, and backed up to towards Shem. That is hugging, or Highway 60 hugs the divide between the waters flowing to the Mediterranean to the west and flowing to the Dead Sea to the east. So if I'm in the King David Hotel and pour water towards the, it used to be the Inbal, now it's called, what's the Inbal nowadays? It's got a new name.
Pa'amon, whatever, something Pa'amon.
By Gana Pamon, the water in Gana Pamon, or basically Nebuch Rephaim, goes to the Mediterranean. The water from Nachal Kidron or Geben Hinnom from Sheriapo goes to the Dead Sea. To Nachal Oak. And the divide is Highway 60. Emek Rephaim is the only emek in Jerusalem that you can pour a cup of water and the water go all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. It winds around like crazy, passes Beit Shemesh on the way. But Emek Rephaim is as I can go from Emek Rephaim, basically I can go from the old train station all the way to the Mediterranean without going uphill. I'm going to wind around like a snake. It's going to take hours, but that's why the train was built in Emek Rephaim. If anyone ever took that old train, it goes like, it winds around like crazy. Now, the new train is built on tunnels and bridges, so that solves the problem. That's why it's so much faster. But if you can't build tunnels and bridges, like in the time of the Turks, you build it in the valley going around. Now, because Emek Rephaim connects you to the area of the Plishtim, so the best way for the Plishtim to come to attack David, if he's not built a city in Yerushalayim, is in Emek Rephaim. So Emek Rephaim strategically is important, and therefore the Plishtim come through Emek Rephaim to attack Ir David. They'll take them right there. And therefore, the battle near David is going to secure Yerushalayim and secures the capital. So that's chapter 5 in a nutshell. In chapter 6, what happens? Where are we? There's our zoom. That's not good. There we go. In chapter 6. Okay. Chapter 6. Share my screen. And here we are. Okay. Chapter 6 is David's request. David brings the Aron to Yerushalayim. We'll talk about that soon. And again, he wants to make Jerusalem his capital city, and he wants to make it connected to God. Then he wants to build a house for God in chapter 7, and then wars upon the temple. And now we're going to see what's in these chapters. I meant to open up a Tanakh instead. Share my screen and open up my Tanakh. Here we go. We had chapter 5, the war with the Plishtim that secured the city. All the way down to Gezer, by the way, that's near Shalavim. It's by the Trun. And basically, he's able to take the whole mountain area down to the coastal plain. In chapter 6, what's he do? He says, let's bring the Aron to Yerushalayim. We'll see this more detailed in Divrei Yamim soon. And they bring the Aron. The second something goes wrong and Uzzah dies, David sees that a sign from God he's going too fast or something's not right. And he takes a break. After 3 months, he sees that God's blessing the house of Obed Edom, and he decides to continue the journey. When he brings the Aron, David is dancing down with the people. And here, Pasuk Yedal, David Mechalker b'Oz lifnei Hashem, David Chogor efod bad, David Chol Beit Yisrael Madim et Aron Hashem b'Torah b'Kol Shofar. Then Aron comes near David, and Pasuk Tevav is key. Umichal bat Shaul, that's her whole name, their last family name, looking from the window, terribly embarrassed about her husband. Remember, he said Michal grew up in England. She's embarrassed by her father's behavior. And we'll return to this in a minute. They bring the Aron to the Ohel. We'll see this later in Divrei Yamim. He gives out food. He gives like a little present for everyone to take home. It makes it a big event. And then when David gets back home, but David, but Tomer, she yells at her husband, what are you doing down there, a man of your stature? You're the king, dancing down with the simple people? It's not mechubad, it's not honorable. So you see Michal's chinuch, her education, her understanding of kingdom, in contrast to David, and this is what David tells her. V'yomer David, Michal, God who chose me. I'm dancing in front of God. In front of God, remember David says, somebody who thinks he's a nobody. That's what makes him worthy of becoming king. God who chose me over your father and his whole household to make me the leader of Israel, of Hashem, and that's why I danced in front of him. And this is not making me, in other words, I'm purposely lowering myself in front of God, and that is my honor. And the greatest honor I could have, you think in the eyes of these mothers who saw me dancing, I looked low. No, that's exactly how I sanctify God and present myself as a nobody because we're in front of God. And in light of that, Chumash tells us Michal bat Shaul doesn't have children from David till the day she dies, because that would have been the perfect king. Had Michal and David had a child together, we would have had royalty from both sides. But we're basically getting rid of the house of Shaul because of that character. So we see in the story this character trait of Shaul, where the honor of the king is more important than the honor of God, and David, the honor of God, is more important than the honor of the king. And again, that's what makes David worthy. Now we come to our topic today of, I'm going to skip to the end of Perachet, because I mentioned it last time, when we have the end of the unit that began with Ben Shoshim Shana David Mocho, it ends with, how does it end? God saved David from all his enemies around. By Mloch David al Kol Yisrael, we're in the end of chapter 8. David came over Israel, by David Osem, Mishpat Tzedakah L'chol Amo. That'll be special about King David doing Mishpat and Tzedakah, fulfilling the theme of Bereshit of why we're chosen to be God's people. Then we have his cabinet members, and this ends a unit, and we'll see how more units work this way later on. We have the Yoav in charge of the army, and Yoshaphat in charge of the government, and Sadok in charge of the temple, and David's sons are ministers in the government, not priests in the temple, but they're helping run the country. Menachem to this day, which is kept. Now, let's go back to chapter 7 and get to our topic today, why David can't build the Mikdash. Now, Vayiki yeshav HaMelech bebeito, B'Hashem iniach lo misaviv mikol levav, V'yomer Melech HaNatan Navi, Rei Anochi yoshev bebeit harazim, V'ron elim yoshev b'toch ha'iriyah. I always explain from this pasuk that David is Yeshiva Bacher, because what does he do? He asks a question with the Kal V'chomer. What does he say? Instead of saying, I want to build a house for God, what's he say? Listen, I'm in a Beit HaRazim, I'm living in a palace, and God is living in a tent. Now, that doesn't mean that he should move to a tent. It means God should also have something permanent. And Natan tells David, do, because God's with you. God's with you. He doesn't wait for Nevuah. It's such an easy question, he can paskin it by himself. Let me explain what's going on with Natan. Why does David think it's the time to build a temple for God? Who can tell me what happened to I can move myself to the gallery view so I can see you guys. Okay. Tell me why David thinks it's time to build a house for God. Yeah, Mindy, just unmute yourself, Mindy. You press the space bar, you can do it. You don't know how to unmute yourself? Just if you press the space bar and hold it, you're unmuted. Okay. Yes, it's not working. Already.
He conquered enough land to own all of Israel.
Okay. But is he still fighting, or are things quieted down?
He's got rest from his enemies.
Yes, rest. Remember, God said when you reach Menachem and Achala, then you can build a house for God. The psukim we saw last week in Sefer Devarim, when you reach Menachem and Achala, it's time to build a house for God. David's sure it's time. He reached the high point, and therefore he thinks it's time to build a house for God. Now, why is a palace called a Beit HaRazim? To build a palace, you need a big roof. You need a long roof. Remember, if in any wedding hall, you don't want pillars in the middle of the wedding hall. So to make a palace, in a house, you can have like expanse of 3-4 meters. You can use sycamore trees. If I want to build a palace with a big open area like a palace has, I need a beam for my roof, at least 10 meters. That I can only get with a cedar tree in Lebanon. Therefore, in order to build a palace, I need to import lumber from Lebanon because they have the long cedar trees. Therefore, a palace is called a Beit HaRazim because I need cedar trees to build it. So David's saying, I'm sitting in a palace made out of cedar wood for its roof, and God is in a tent and basically wants to build a house for God. Now, from what you remember, what's God's answer? What's the answer everyone always says? Ask 9 out of 10 people. What will they tell you?
God says he doesn't need a house.
Because, one is God doesn't need a house. The other is, David's a man of war. Because David has blood on his hands, he can't do it. The problem is it doesn't say that here in Sefer Shmuel. Let's see what it says. We'll read God's answer carefully. God says as follows. I'm going to actually move to an English Hebrew Tanakh. It'll be easier to follow. Here we go. We're going to read now in Sefer Shmuel. There we are. Over Shmuel Bet Perek Zayin. God's answer is a little cryptic, but let's try and follow. No, we want Shmuel Bet chapter 7. Here we go. Okay. Okay. First, Natan says yes, and then that night, God tells Natan, slow down. Now, go tell David, are you the one to build a house for God? He says, I've been in a house since I took people out of Egypt. I've been going in a Ohel and a Mishkan. I've been going from Gilgal and to Shiloh and to Nov and to Givon, but I never asked anyone to build a house for me. And every time I went through all the Shvatim, remember every Shevet almost all the Shvatim had a Shofet. I never asked any of the Shoftim to build a house for me. And now go tell David. Here says, I brought you up from the minor leagues and made you leader of my people. Now listen carefully, Pasuk Tet. I've been with you. I'm helping you. I made you leader. Everywhere you walked. I got rid of all your enemies. But I made a great name for you. You're famous. I gave security and stability to the people of Israel. And they're dwelling nice in their land. And hopefully it won't get bad again. And hopefully enemies won't hurt us again. And now gives this big answer. From the time I commanded Shoftim, from the time of the Shoftim, after Yeshua, on my people, I gave you more rest than anyone else. So God agrees, we reached a menucha. Okay? This is a stranger's answer. David says, I have a house, and I want to build a house for you. God says, you can't build a house for me. First I have to build a house for you. David says he has a house. So Beit here doesn't mean a house. Beit here means a dynasty. And God's telling David, before you can build a house for God, you need to have a stable dynasty. To have a stable dynasty, it's not enough for you to become king. You have to have a child who's going to succeed you and continue your way. And when you establish that dynasty, by your son taking over, that will enable that next generation to build a house for God. He explains that in Pasuk Yud. Kiblu yamecha. Right? Your days will be finished. You'll die basically. And one of your children will become king from your offspring. I'll get his kingdom ready. I'll prepare his kingdom. God's answer is not no, but not yet. I'll help him establish his kingdom. God's telling David, you think you reached level 10, you reached 9.5, not level 10. To reach level 10, to be able to build a house for God, you need to have a dynasty. You have to have a child taking over for you. So, now again, maybe had Michal had a child from David, maybe it could have worked because we have a kingdom from both sides. But the kingdom was still unstable because of the civil war with Shaul and all the tension with Shaul. We need one more generation of quiet and security and stability to build a house for God, because you can't build a house for God when things are unstable. That says, unlike Shaul, now that you're chosen, I'll be with him like a father. He'll be like for me a son, or I'll help him much. But if he does something wrong, I can't get rid of him because you're chosen forever, but I can really give him a hard time. That'll be key. With Malchut David now is chosen forever. Yoshi gave a whole shir on this in the Hebrew program. It's his claim is why Shaul is punished and David's not, because Shaul's sin was before he was chosen forever, and therefore he can lose his kingdom. David was promised a kingdom forever, and therefore God, just like God can't break his brit with the Jewish people, he can't break his brit with David. So we can punish David left and right, but a kingdom has to come from David, and therefore his chosenness isn't dependent on his behavior. He's chosen, but if he messes up, he'll get punished harshly by God, but will never lose the monarchy. So again, I'll warn you. I'll give you. I'll chasten you. It says, I'll give you rebuke by punishing you and your children, but I won't take away your kingdom forever. But by chasdi, I won't take away my commitment to you, like I did with Shaul, who was before you, and therefore your house will be established forever, and basically, your chosenness of Malchut David is like its chosenness forever, just like the chosenness of Am Yisrael. That's what God told David, and David is super happy. He's thankful to God. David says, "Who am I? It's my business to do such a thing." And I never thought of this. And we quote here from Mincha and Shabbat. Here, Al King Gadata Hashem praises God, you're so great. King Kamocha, Beinam Zotecha, Umi Kamcha Yisrael Goechad Ba'aretz. Davening comes from here. And her God came to redeem them as a people, to make a name for him. See the theme of making a name for God. With all the great things you did in our land, and that's why he took us out of Egypt. Okay? And therefore, David prays that indeed my kingdom will be established, and I'll be able to make a name for you. And here's the theme of Har Sinai. Remember, Batem to the Am, remember, Brit Milah was L'chad Elohim, coming out of Egypt. The biggest theme of Chumash repeats itself over and over again. And David's hoping that he will help facilitate that through his kingdom. And therefore, David prays that indeed you should keep that promise. You made my name great, so I can make your name great. Remember the whole theme of Hamakom Hashem, the Shaken Shmuel Sham, to make his name great. And my name and your name should be associated together. Okay? Because he says that's why you chose me, etc. And your words should come true. And therefore he asked for a blessing and bless his household, that God should be with you. So that's basically, God doesn't tell David no, God tells him not yet, but David gets an answer he never dreamed of, pretty much, that he'd be chosen forever. I just want to show you one pasuk in Yirmiyahu that ties all this together. If you go to Yirmiyahu chapter 33 at the end, if I'm not mistaken, when we're leaving and the people think God's left us, Yirmiyahu tells the people, okay, Halo re'ita ma'am dibru lemor. What are the people saying? These two families that God chose, he unchose them by Masem, like he did to Shaul, my nation, okay, for being a nation, and Kol Hashem imlo briti yamam v'layla, just like I made a treaty with heaven and earth. Remember the Brit Keshet after the flood. Okay? I don't change the laws of nature. Gam zer Yaakov v'David Avdi amas. Just like I won't break my covenant with nature, I won't break my covenant with Yaakov, which is the people of Israel, and my covenant with the house of David, from taking anyone else to be the governors of the land over Zerah of Yaakov, over Isaac and Yaakov, because I'll bring them back, I'll bring my nation back, I'll bring the kingdom back, and that's Yirmiyahu's promise. Even though they're going to exile, one day they'll come back. So you see that idea of a eternal brit. If you have time, you can read Tehillim 89, Peitet, where the Mizmor says, what happened? How come you're not fulfilling your promise for the house of David? Now, where does this story come from about blood on his hands? So before we get there, just real quickly, in chapter 8, in where's Samuel 1? Here we go. Shmuel 2, chapter 8. After all this, we have some more battles, which shows you David really doesn't have Menachem and Achala yet. He has more wars with the Plishtim. He fights Moab, and he's very successful against Moab. And he fights Aram Damascus, he fights Syria. Basically, he's fighting to the west and to the east and to the northeast. And David has governors in Aram Damascus. He's got the Golan area now. And they pay him taxes. And then he takes all the gold and brings it to Yerushalayim. We'll see in a minute. And he gives everything to the Beit HaMikdash. Here. And he takes all the captive, he gets all the gold and silver here. Gamotam ikdish HaMelech David LaHashem Makesav Azav Asher ikdish Mikol Gam Asher Kibesh. Because now that he mentioned he wants to build a temple, all of his military victories he dedicates the shalal, the booty of all those battles, to the temple treasury to be able to build a Beit HaMikdash from Aram and from Moab and from Neamon and from Plishtim and from Amalek and from Hadezer. Okay? And Melech Sova. Basically, all his great military accomplishments, he uses that money to build the Mikdash. And then he controls Edom already also, but he's setting up his hegemony. And then Vayosh Hashem et David b'chosher alach. And then the famous ending Psukim of the unit, David's king over Israel, and does Mishpat and Staka. That's what makes him special. Yoav on the army, Yoshaphat, Maskir, and Sadok Kohanim. Now, this ends a unit. We had something very similar beforehand. And the unit, remember we said 13 and 14 was Malchut Shmuel, Malchut Shaul. When that ended, it began, in chapter 13, with the pasuk that was missing something. Remember? Ben Shana, Ben something Shanim, Shova Mochol, V'shen Shanim Alat. That was the introduction to the unit, with words truncated on purpose. That ended in chapter 14 with all his military accomplishments, summarized. Yeah. And Vayashom Echrei Plishtim, V'shol Lachat HaMlucha, Vayidachem Saviv B'Choevav, B'Moab, B'nei Ammon, B'Edom, Machitzova, etc. V'Yaschav Malek, and then Shaul's children were Yonatan, etc., and his daughters, his family, and Eshet Shaul, and who's in charge of the army? Sartzvo was Aviner, and Kish Abi Shaul, and we're all working in his government, and there was war the whole time with the Plishtim, and Shaul built up the army. So that ends the unit, and the next story was Amalek, and his punishment, and how he lost his kingdom. So I'm just showing you there's units. I'll show you another unit. Another unit starts in chapter 9, because we finished one in chapter 8. At the end of chapter 20, we have a very similar ending. Yoav was in charge of the army, Benel ben Yada on the royal guard, the Kreti and Pleti, Adoram in charge of collecting the money, the treasury, Yoshua was a maskir, run the government pretty much, Sar Pnim, and there's the official Sefer, and Aviatar was the Kohanim, and Ira Yari served as David's minister in his government. Because beforehand his kids were helping him, now his kids gave him too much trouble, so he had other people helping him run the country.
Why does it matter those names?
All these names?
Yeah, like why does it matter?
That's the style. When I finish a unit, I have the cabinet.
Okay.
It's like giving credits like the end of a movie and have, who the
Okay.
producer was and who's running the show. I'm just showing every unit begins with Ben Shana, or Ben Kama Shani,
Right.
Shana, Koli Machol, Ben Balach, and then the details, and then we end it. I'm doing that to show you that chapters 5 through 8 is a standalone unit, chapters 9 through 20 is a standalone unit.
Right. Okay.
5 through 8 is why David's chosen in his connection to the temple. And the next one is going to be why he's, that even though he sinned, he's not unchosen, but he pays a heavy price. All these terrible things that happen in his life all stem from David and Bathsheba. And, he himself said he should pay 4 times over. And now there's going to be a logical reason why all these things go wrong. Once he sinned with Bathsheba, don't be surprised that Amnon does what he does to Tamar. And don't be surprised that he can't stop him because who's he to give him Musar? And don't be surprised that Avshalom goes and kills his brother who messed with his sister, kills Amnon. And don't be surprised that people get sick of David being so passive and things are so empty, or things aren't running anymore, that Avshalom and a lot of David's followers now want Avshalom is more active because David's old already and can't govern anymore. We'll see those psukim. Actually, I'm going to see them right now because I want to go back to. I'm just going to show you one example of that, and because I'm not going to deal with David and Bathsheba, that's too complicated for a short series. I want to focus more on the temple side. But in chapter 15 in Shmuel Bet, after David is very passive, so Avshalom makes the Merkabah. Basically, he has people, horses, and chariots running in front of him. He has a 50-man honor guard. He gets up in the morning, and this is great. This is classic politics. How does he build public support? Vishkim Avshalom got up early in the morning. He stood by the gate of the king's palace where people would come for judgment. And people would go to the king for judgment, like we saw with the 2 women, but later with Shlomo. Anyone with a complaint to the king for a mishpat. So Avshalom told him, hey, where are you from? He doesn't say what. He doesn't get to think. First, he's Mr. Nice Guy. Hey, what city are you from? What high school did you go to? What neighborhood are you from? What shul do you daven at? Do you know this guy? We call place Jewish geography, right? And the person answered, I'm from one of the tribes of Israel. He's building his base support. Fermi love Avshalom. Avshalom tells you know what? I think you have a good point. He asked him what your issue is. You have a good case. You know what? The king, he's an old man. He can't listen to you. Basically, he's building support. I can do a better job than my father. I wish I could be the shofet, the man judging the country. And everyone should come to me for his judgment. And when people would come to bow down to him, he would send out his hand, give him a kiss, shake his hand, etc. And Avshalom did this all the time. But people came to the king, and by Ganev Avshalom at Levan Shei Yisrael, he becomes popular. It just shows you how you come to power by being a very sly politician. Now, doing it for a good reason is fine, but Avshalom's goal is not mishpat. Avshalom's goal is political power. So he pretends to be Mr. Nice Guy, giving people judgment, but his judgment is not based on judgment; it's based on popularity, and that's what the Nabi is pointing out. That's why he's the wrong man for the job. But that leads to his but what enables him to do his coup d'etat and take over the country was the fact that David is very passive. And you see that in Avshalom's statement that no, the king's not listening to you, but I can do a better job than my father. So that's an example of how that whole unit technically is, I can give political reasons for all the trouble David has, but the unit, by putting them all next to each other, related all to David's sin with Bathsheba. Now let's go back to why David can't build the Beit HaMikdash. In Sefer Divrei Yamim, now I go back to my source sheet, do this and finish up in a couple of minutes. Stop the share and go back to my source sheet. Okay. In Sefer Divrei Yamim, we have as follows. So again, we saw in Shmuel Bet where here in Divrei Yamim it goes as follows. In Perek Yud Gimel, we have a key line that explains what makes David special. Before David does anything, he consults with the leaders of the country. He doesn't do his own things. He wants to make sure the government and the people are with him. Do you agree with the next move? Are you with me on this? And if this is coming from God, our success, etc. Let's gather the whole nation together. During Shaul's kingdom, the Mikdash, the Aron, and the Mishkan were collecting dust. They weren't giving any attention. The Aron was collecting dust in Kiryat Yearim. The Mishkan, first in Nov, and they wiped out Nov, and they moved it to Givon. But at the center of Shaul's kingdom is Shaul, and his capital in Givat Shaul. There's no centrality to the Mishkan at all. It makes no effort to make a big deal about it. David's saying, under Shaul's kingdom, people didn't care about the Mikdash, and I am going to do that. Now, who can tell me why David is using this word nifritzah? What's nifritzah have to do with building the Beit HaMikdash? Can anyone tell me?
Comes from Peretz.
Very good. Okay, the word from Peretz. David's from Peretz. That's one we'll see the word Peretz comes up there a lot. And if you were in shul this week, the first thing God told Yaakov, Ufaratzta. Remember, Yama became a son of
right, Ufaratzta, right, this week, yeah.
That's right. You can see from it goes back to Peretz as well. But the idea of spreading out in all four directions is very central to the idea of a Mikdash. Because the Mikdash, we have that connection, that ladder between heaven and earth that brings God down to earth in this place. And Yaakov says, if this place where God is here on earth, from here I can spread out in all four directions. So therefore, the Sulam connecting heaven to earth, from that place, I build a Beit Elokim, and from there, God's not in a cage, but rather God can spread out in all four directions. So therefore, the word nifritzah is cute. And the ironic wordplay, who is the person who is not taking care of their own properly? Remember? Uzzah, but what's it called? What happened to Uzzah? Parat, remember Peretz Uzzah?
Yeah.
See in a minute. So the word Ufaratzta, nifritzah is moving a little bit too fast, that's all. And Hashem gets angry. But the Chumash, I mean,
it's going down.
He prots in a very special way. So let's go back now to the Psukim and see what it says. Okay. Okay. And the people said, you know what? Ki yashar dabar b'nei kol. The people were on this. Remember? Isha yashar beinav yaseh in Sefer Shoftim, and now Isha yashar beinav as far as building a house for God. Then we gathers the word Vayakel again. All of Israel together from our widest borders, from Egypt down to Syria, to bring the Aron from Kiryat Yearim, and they bring it together, and they bring a place to associate with God's name. And when David brings the Aron to Yerushalayim, this Divrei Yamim focuses more on all David's efforts to build the Mikdash, because in the beginning of Beit Sheni, they need inspiration to take initiative to build a Mikdash, and therefore Divrei Yamim, written at the beginning of Beit Sheni, is sharing stories about all the efforts King David did to build a Mikdash, and that's going to explain what's in Divrei Yamim as opposed to what's in Sefer Shmuel. So most of Divrei Yamim Aleph are about all the efforts that King David does to build up Yerushalayim and the Mikdash. In fact, it's almost everything in the book only focuses on that topic. So they bring the Aron to Yerushalayim, they put it in the tent. David finished bringing all the korbanot. He blesses the people again, b'shem Hashem. Everyone gets a little package to bring home. Okay? And what does David do? He doesn't let the Aron collect dust like it was doing in Kiryat Yearim, Vayten lifnei aron Hashem, min alvim v'shartim. David sets aside a choir and Levi'im who are going to sing. Laskir lodot la'alel Hashem Yisrael. Makes this Philharmonic orchestra. The Aron is going to be a place where people are going to sing God's praises. The capital city, which is the center of King David's government, will be a city known of praising God. That's a totally different way of running a country. Shaul builds up the army, builds up the nation and its military and maybe its economic status, but God is not at the center. When David builds up the country, at the center of his capital city is God's house, a place for God, singing God's praises, and basically Sefer Tehillim. And that's a critical difference in running a country between Shaul and David. Okay? Now, Asaph was in charge of the Kohanim, etc. And finally, on that day, David put Asaph and his brethren to lead the Tehillim and singing in the temple. Therefore, that's why I have so many Mizmori Asaph and later Bnei Korach in Sefer Tehillim. And what song did they sing? What psalm did they sing? When they bring the Aron back, that's the famous Hudal Hashem Kiru B'Shmo, Diva B'Notav. What we say every morning in Pesukei Zimra is from Divrei Yamim. Now, it's very similar to Tehillim 105, that's a shir in itself, but what we say every day in davening is David telling the people, it's our job to praise God, call his name, make his name known, basically make a name for God, and that's the whole theme of David's kingdom. The Mizmor that we say every day in Pesukei Zimra, which we begin Pesukei Zimra with, but it's our duty. Who has to praise God? Zera Yisrael B'do B'nei B'chirav. The nation that God chose, they're obligated to sing God's praises, sing about Him, talk about Him, praise Him, look for Him all the time, remember all the great things He does, and we fulfill this every day by saying Pesukei Zimra. And then we have to remember His brit, and as He's going to watch our history, we're going to sing His praises. Anyway, that's the shir on Tehillim on Divrei Yamim. I just want to point out that our daily Pesukei Zimra is based on this story, what David does when he brings Aron to Yerushalayim, all in an attempt to bring God into the center of the nation. Now, then in chapter 17, Divrei Yamim, you have the exact same story like in Menachem, where in Sefer Shmuel, where David wants to build a house and God says, not you, but your son. And now we get chapter 21. David, towards the end of his career, wants to know how successful he's been. And by mistake, he wants to count how many soldiers he has or how many people he has in his country. And he does his census and he counts all the people. Not he's about to go to war, just to know how big his army is. God's angry with that. That's the famous plague that comes from counting the people. But David's slipping a little bit. And God brings the plague and David takes responsibility. And then Navi God. That's why this section has to be from God. David tells, and that's why it's in the last section of Sefer Shmuel at the end. But God gives David 3 choices. Remember, 3 days of plague, 3 months of losing wars, or 3 years or 7 years of famine, depending on what you're using. And David says, give me the plague directly. Not B'yad Hashem, we put in Tachnun. What's important for us is the next event. What happens? David builds a mizbeach like God told him on the field of Arav the Jebusite, later becoming Har Bayit. He calls out to God in prayer. He does tshuva, remember? God answers him from heaven, eating the korban on the mizbeach. Now, when David sees that God answers his prayer and appears to him there and accepts his korban, right? God tells the malach to stop the punishment. No, God answered the prayer, stop the plague. At that time, when God answered David's prayer on this spot, Beit Hahi, Birot David Ke'anau Hashem B'gorn Aron Havivusi Ba'izbachsham, and parenthetically, the Mishkan in the meantime was in Givon, and David couldn't go to Givon because of the Aron. What does David say? Now in Perach HaBet, B'Yemar David Zehu Beit Hashem Elohim B'Zeh Mizbach L'Olad Yisrael. David decides, not God. David decides this is a place to build a house for God. Now, how does that make sense? According to Chumash, who decides where the Beit HaMikdash is going to be? What Sefer Dvarim say? HaMakom HaShivchar Hashem L'Shaken Shmo Sham. Doesn't God have to decide? On the other hand, it says the Shichnoti T'Shuvat Hashem, but you have to look for it. What I want to claim is, like we see from Yaakov, the place that God's choosing, God's not choosing a place to build a temple. God's choosing a place to answer prayer. If God appears to you somewhere, answers your prayer, communicates with you, then that's a place to build a temple. How do we know that? From Yaakov. Yaakov decided to build a Beit Elokim on the spot. Why? Because God appeared to Yaakov in that place, made him a promise, answered his prayer, said, I'm going to watch over you and take care of you and keep my covenant with you. In a place where God answers prayer, that's the place to build for a temple. So, Hamakom Yivchar Hashem, not a place that God's going to choose to build a temple, a God chooses to answer prayer. The Shichnot Yishu, you look for it, basically. David, because God answered David's prayer at this spot and appeared to him and answered his prayer, David says, this is a place to build a house for God. Yeah, that's a very different understanding, but I think it makes a lot more sense. It explains the apparent contradiction between who decides where the temple is going to be. Now, in light of that, let's look what David does. After David said, this is the place to build a house for God, remember David, now we need builders, and Jews aren't going to do the stonework, as we all know. So we need foreign workers. So David gets all the local population, the Gerim of the land, to do the the masonry work and digging out the stones, etc., for to build a house for God, and all the metal work, etc. He gets all the things ready, and all the wood, all the lumber that came from Lebanon. Now he can't build it, but David's going to get everything ready for his son to build it. Now we'll end our share with why David can't build the Beit HaMikdash. Remember David Shlomo b'nei Navarach. Right? He tells his son Shlomo, right? You're young, you're a teenager, and building a house for God, a Beit L'Hashem l'agdil l'mala, right? The purpose of this house is not for my name, but for God's name, for God's reputation, the Shem Tiferet, for God's glory in the eyes of the nations. I got everything ready. David got everything ready so Shlomo can build the Mikdash as soon as he's king. And he called Shlomo to charge him in public, right, to build a house for God, for the God of Israel. And David gives a speech now to his son. He has to explain to him how come he didn't build it, why his son has to build it. So David tells Shlomo, I really wanted to build a house for God. I didn't Levi, again, the purpose of the house, the Beit L'Shem Hashem Elohai. Okay. But God told me, now, he doesn't quote what God told him, wait for another son. He gives a more detailed explanation. Dam l'rov shafachta. This is what everyone quotes all the time. But this is David talking to his son, not Hashem talking to David. But this is David's understanding that he explains to his son. David says, why can't I build a house for God? I was living in a time of war. Wars that were needed. You were living in a time of war. Wars that had to be fought. Great wars. Okay? You can't build a house for me because Damim Rab Shim Shabach, you're a man of war. So it's a time for war and a time for peace. Part of the lack of stability in the time of David is because of the wars with the other nations, the civil wars going on. Now God tells David explains to Shlomo, I couldn't, because I'm living in a time of war, I don't want you to be like your father. Your father was a man of war, I don't want you to be a man of war. When you become king, don't do more conquests. Focus, there's a time for war and a time for peace. You settle down. Hine bendo ladlach, you're going to have a child. He should be a man of menucha. It's not a prediction. It's direction. It's guidance. He should be a man of rest. I'll give him rest from enemies around him. There's no need to fight anymore if he consolidates his kingdom. Call him Shlomo. Shlomo will be his name. Why? Because Shalom v'Sheket. If it's calling him Shlomo, it's not a prediction. It's direction. What he needs to be in order to build a house for God, you need to be a man of peace. You have to be Shalom, and therefore call him Shlomo. Who'll build a house for me? I'll be like a father for him. He'll be like a son, like we saw in Shmuel. I'll get his kingdom ready. And therefore, my son, God should be with you. You should be conditional, but make sure to keep the Torah, to keep all the mitzvot, and then you'll be able to be successful. As tatzliach, if you keep all the mitzvot, it's not to build a house for God. You have to follow the laws carefully. So David's telling Shlomo, here, I got everything ready. I get in my poor budget. I get everything ready for God's house, all the gold and silver, etc. And now it's time for you to put it all together. And he commands the government people of Israel to help Shlomo build a house for God. And God will get you ready to finish the project. Okay? And therefore, he said, what's it say here? Put your hearts, like in Sefer Dvarim, to search God, see the drosh, the shichnot tidrushu. So that's the and therefore we'll see when Shlomo was born, he gets two names, Shlomo, that's what David calls him, and Natan calls him Yedidah, because he has to be Yedid Hashem, remember the Brachat Binyamin, where we'll build the Mikdash, Yedid Hashem Yishkon Lebetach Alav, and therefore that'll be the one building that temple for God. Now, what I want to end with is it's not a din in the person. It's not David spilled blood, therefore you killed someone, you can't build the Mikdash. We'll talk about this next week when David gives his hit list to Shlomo. If David can't build the Mikdash because there's blood on his hands, and Shlomo's going to build the Mikdash, why does David tell his son, kill all these people as soon as you become king? Doesn't make any sense, but we'll use that to explain how this explanation will make more sense, because we need, for the sake of stability, he's going to give him those directions. What I want to end with is, I see from Divrei Yamim, David's focusing all of his efforts on building a house for God. Again, we'll go next week. I'll use Divrei Yamim to explain the introduction to Sefer Menachem as well. But how can David say that God told him, you're an Ish Tamim? God didn't say he's an Ish Tamim. So I want to share with you a story that we have in the Absalom revolt. I'm sorry. Run the screen, share my screen, and I want this one. In the revolt against Absalom, in chapter 16, David's running away from the city. And, no, it needs Shmuel Bet, not Shmuel Aleph. David's running away from the city. And here, David's coming to Bachurim, he runs away from Jerusalem. And someone comes out to meet him as he's leaving, running away from Yerushalayim when Absalom's taking over the city. His name is Shimei ben Gera, who Chazal says David's Rabbi. We'll see why soon. And he goes out and cursing King David and throwing stones. Nothing's changed in Jerusalem. You have your political opponent, you throw stones at him, and you curse him, and you yell things at him. By Sagabarim with David, and all David's men, and all the people with David. And basically, this guy is cursing out David as he's leaving the city. And this is what Shimei says. Get out of here, you man of war. And you're an evil person of Israel. You get what you deserve. Heshiv alecha Hashem et kol demei Beit Shaul asher malachta tachtav. V'yiten Hashem et hamlucha b'yad Avshalom banecha v'imcha baratecha ki ish tamim ata. You understand why I need the book of Shmuel that supports my point all along. This is what people were thinking. David is a rotten person. Look what he did to the house of Shaul. Look how he took over the kingdom. You're an Ish Tamim. David was known by many people as an Ish Tamim because he caused all these civil wars. And he uprooted this kingdom of Shaul, which was so great. So there's a big political movement that really doesn't accept David. And it's led here by Shimei ben Gera. You have later Leibtag ben Bichri doing something similar. What's Avishai want to do? Avishai tells David, let me kill the guy, right? He goes, how to let this guy go in and kill me? Let me go and knock off his head. This is what David tells him. Remember David. What do you call it? Fanatics, what do you call it? Trigger hungry people. Okay? Let him curse me. Why? Ki Hashem amar lo David. That's not Shimei cursing me, that's God. We amar madu asit again. V'yimar David el v'adav. Hine b'nei asher yatzal mimem v'akish et nafshi v'av katad ben hemini. Hanichu lo v'yikalel ki amar lo Hashem. David tells his men, let him curse me all he wants. That's not Shimei, that's God. David sees the voice of Shimei as Musar. When Shimei says, say Shadamim, in David's eyes, that's not Shimei talking, that's God talking, because David takes responsibility for all the trouble he caused. He didn't want to cause the trouble, but thanks to David and what happened with him, David caused a terrible civil war between Abner and Yoav. David split the kingdom. The war with Avshalom. There's so much bloodshed between the tribes. Now, David didn't want that to happen, but he takes responsibility for it. Like the leader should. And he says, when Shimei's yelling at him, that's not Shimei, that's God. So Shimei says, say Ish Adamim. And David says, that's not Shimei, that's God. So when David says to Shlomo that I can't build the house because I'm an Ish Damim, I think it's built on here, because David's saying, I couldn't build a house for God because I was living in a time of civil war. I was responsible for the civil war. Therefore, I can't be the one building the temple. You have to be a man of peace, bring the tribes together, and don't let political arguments bring the country down. Make sure you're a man of peace and don't be responsible for another civil war, another strife between people. Be a man of peace. So I think that's when David tells his son Shlomo, I'm an Ish Tamim, that God told me, I think he's referring to the fact that he was responsible for civil wars between the people. And God told David through the voice of Shimei. And that's my little take on it. I would apply that to now modern day politics. That's up to everyone on their own. Okay, any quick questions real fast? My time's up.
Civil war or what he did with all of his neighbors on the East Coast?
Both, but for sure civil war. You can't build with civil war like that going on. There's too many scars from all the battles. You can't build a Mikdash when people are fighting with each other and within the first decade of that. You need a couple years of peace and quiet to settle down. And same with your neighbors. Your neighbors, you're fighting wars. They're not going to come in. You need another generation. Like right after World War II, Germany and England aren't going to talk to each other. A generation later, though, get together if they're playing the same Eurovision and the same soccer leagues and do business together. They may have a little competition, but it won't be what people thought would be after the war. But you need nothing like time to heal old feuds and stuff. So again,
David didn't attack Shaul's people.
Yeah, but David feels responsible. Now if he had good advisors, PR advisors, he wouldn't take responsibility. He'd say, no, it's not my fault. It's someone else's fault.
Oh, sure.
That's so great. That's what's great about David. It's not his fault, but he takes responsibility because he's in charge. And he prays for it, and he takes full responsibility. And he leaves, he says, if God wants me back, God will bring me back. He doesn't force himself into power. He leaves the country. He leaves the nation and says, if God wants me back, he'll bring me back. And leave the Aron in Yerushalayim, he tells his men, I'm not taking the Aron. The Aron is not a military tool.
Not me.
In Yerushalayim, if I'm worthy coming back, God will bring me back. That's what makes David great. That he was Mr. Perfect, but he learned from his mistakes and he saw God behind everything. He was always questioning his own worthiness of his chosenness. Supposed to show. Okay, we'll take this all next week when we start Sefer Menachem. We'll do the transition and we'll put them together from that angle. Okay, everyone have a good week.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye bye.